Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Eduardo Barca with co-host, teacher and socialist Andy Lipson and community organizing socialist Kenny Cepeda. We are online at what-s-left.webnode.com. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, jot down our information, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. Well, today it's just the three of us.
Yes.
It's been a while, right?
Yeah.
And we'll be discussing the topic of defunding, abolishing the police. But just to remind folks, folks can just also find us on a separate episode that we did similar to what we're going to be discussing about, but on a different path today, on What's Left and on our blog and on YouTube if it's still up, if we're still existing there, because we just got another strike or another punishment.
Medical misinformation.
All right. Everyone's rejecting us. Go ahead.
So about a year ago, we made an episode on June 6th. We uploaded an episode called George Floyd, Why Black Lives Matter. And in that show, we talked about, the topic of the police, the role of racism in society. And I expressed some concerns over, the movement not growing beyond this racial frame. And my concern was that when the other shoe came down, the policing was going to come down harder on the communities that we were trying to protect, especially, the Black community that's already policed, Black and brown communities. And so we've had an election in the meantime. We've gone through the rest of COVID, the shutdowns and all that stuff. And now I started to see a trend in the news, especially liberal media, covering the issue of crime. The New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC News, expressing basically the refocus of majors in the U.S., especially liberal cities, like San Francisco, New York, Chicago, the need of those majors to refocus on the crime that is happening, the uptick in crime. And at the same time, Joe Biden really has been bold in saying he will double down on police, basically. And on June 23rd, he actually expressed that he was going to suggest using COVID funds to increase the police force in our communities. I've also heard anecdotal, accounts of places like in San Francisco and the Tenderloin where there is more police presence than before. There's also in the New York Times, there was recently a story, actually May 21st, where the San Francisco a New York Times reporter that lives in San Francisco made a story about how petty crimes, shoplifting, all this stuff, it's been increasing in San Francisco. However, that's been refuted. So that's been refuted by the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, saying that even the police reports show that there is no uptick. But however, the narrative is that there is an increase in petty crime, that retailers are closing because of the petty crime. Never mind that we went through a whole pandemic. Never mind that there is a whole restructuring of the way we purchase things. However, the focus again is on some of the policies, and they're attacking Chesa Boudin, the district attorney of San Francisco, as being the culprit or one of the culprits of being too loose on crime, basically. So my concern is here: what is happening? Why are we talking about funding the police when we went through a year, where there was at least at the beginning looting, rioting, according to the media, massive protests. Where the beginning of the movement was about abolishing the police, then it moved to defund the police, and now suddenly the focus is on funding the police. So where are the dissenting voices? So why are we here? What has transcurred in this time? And that's what I'm curious to explore with you too.
I think there is a growing a fear amongst many, if people in the liberal circles. Even when I look at the New York elections, one of the candidates was running on the campaign of making sure that there is safety on the streets. And the whole focus was on making sure that there is some reform approach and that there is enough police presence to make our city safe, because there's been a rise, not just here in the Bay Area, but across this country. And so I think progressives and liberals just the left in general has been faced with the growing strong question of what do we do? How do you deal with sort of the homicides, the crime, the violence, and just any sort of just the violence that exists within, especially urban cities. And so I have been struggling to answer that question, because I think to me it's not, when I talk about the police, I think of what potentially could happen, like it happens in Mexico, where you have community organizers not necessarily policing anyone, because they don't have to police anybody, but they take care, and they're armed forces, they take care of their community. But that concept is so hard, because we live in a country where everything is so structurally centered around punishment and making sure that there are it's an incarcerated sort of culture here. So I'll just express my initial thought is just sort of I've been struggling how to answer those questions. I know that in Oakland as well, there have been projects to try to de-escalate or trauma-informed approaches to deal with folks, and it's still being questioned, and it's still being criticized. So I look forward to this conversation.
Well, there was a quote from I think this was one of the articles that Kenny sent out that kicked this off. And it said this, that I think is very interesting. It said, strategists in both parties say the pandemic, long the dominant issues on voters' minds, is beginning to recede as more Americans get vaccinated and deaths decline, opening the door for other issues to capture people's attention. Now, we all here know that the pandemic is a narrative, like the narrative around the pandemic was created by the ruling class, by the capitalist class. The fear that they drove towards making the structural changes they wanted to make so they could collapse the economy, so they could reorganize the economy, so they could essentially build this world that we now describe roughly as big data analytics and the fourth industrial revolution, and get people on dashboards with vaccines. The pandemic didn't make that happen. The ruling class narrative around the pandemic is what made that happen. And it's funny that they basically expose their game here, which is they say, well, this narrative is now coming to an end. It isn't actually. They're wrong to say that. They're going to be using that pandemic narrative over and over again. But they are right to say, well, we have a new narrative now. And the new narrative is cities are on fire due to crime, and that they're going to get more dangerous over the summer. And that we have, and one party is saying, the Republican Party is saying, look what the Democrats did. Look what the left wing of the cap, did. Basically, they demoralized our police force, and now the crime is running rampant through the streets. And here they go. And look, and the Democrats are saying, okay, no, we didn't do that. That's not what we did. We're for actually strengthening the laws. We're actually strengthening the police, and we're for getting rid of people's guns. Like, we're going to take your guns away from you. That's our kind of thing. That's what we'll be doing, And so, and by the way, the Democrats are basically also saying, we got to kind of push this stuff about defund the police to the side now, because we don't want to lose our majority in the 2022 congressional seat elections, right? Well, here's the reality. that violent crime is down by half from what it was in the 1990s. And there has been what they say is a recent uptick in violent crime, what they describe as violent crime. They do not describe violent crime as the U.S. continuing its occupation of Afghanistan with private forces. They do not describe violent crime as attempting coups in South America. They do not describe violent crime as criminalizing our border and making people die as they cross across here. They do not describe violent crime as bombing Syria and Iran or Iraq. Those aren't violent crimes. That's the U.S. just doing its thing. Violent crimes are what they describe as people, working people who are caught doing stuff or might not have done stuff. Who knows? So what they're describing narrowly as violent crime is actually half. It's like it's cut by half since 1990, and it's had a recent uptick. Now, property crime has actually had a 6% decline. They say crime overall, including rapes, robbery, and other property crime, dropped by 6% in 2020. Now, that's not true because there's massive property crime by the capitalists. But again, we're talking about the property crime that they actually put on the books that the police are there to do, the police are there to go after, which is working class crime. So that crime is lower than it was, 6% lower under 2020. Okay? So what is happening right now is a narrative is being made to say why we have to forget everything that was said about defund the police and abolish the police, like Kenny was saying. And there were 2 episodes we did. We did one about the George Floyd movement, and then we did another episode the next week, which was defund the police or derail the movement. Which one is it? Well, we know the answer now. The answer was derail the movement. And that's what's happened, because now the Democrats are doing exactly what we said they would do, which is they're not defunding a single police office. The guy in Minneapolis right now is actually trying to get more police back on the streets, and they're going to use cheap police because they're recruiting from the new ranks. So they've actually done exactly what we said the Minneapolis police would do, which is they abolished the police so they can get rid of some police. Now they get new police and a whole new flood back in, but are cheaper. That's what they did in New Jersey, and that's what they're doing in Minneapolis right now. So that was always a lie, and that's what we said it was, and now it's been proven. And Joe Biden, it's not something to come. He's already said $350 billion of the $1.9 trillion that was being earmarked for the America Relief Fund. He basically said any of that you want to use for the police, and also for the FBI and for surveillance technology that the FBI use. Any of that money you want to use for it, go ahead. That's what he basically said. And if you remember, we were talking about $25 million of cuts in San Francisco, maybe, even though that was going to be much lower than what it was for other places. Well, that's not on the board anymore. Now it's about beefing up the police to pre-pandemic levels and beyond the pandemic levels. That's what they're talking about. So this basically exposes a few things. One, the Democrats. What was Joe Biden doing? Joe Biden was at the funeral of George Floyd. He was at that funeral, and Black Lives Matter said, "Come on to our funeral. Let him do that." And has Black Lives Matter said anything about Joe Biden doing the $350 billion to the police? No, they're going to shut up because they don't want to lose it, because that thing is completely captured by the Democratic Party. The Black Lives Matter movement, it doesn't exist as an independent force, and the Democratic Party are doing exactly what their role is, which is redirecting all the anger that was about fighting racism and doing 2 things, well, at least 2 things. One is it's going to whip up racism. Well, they're going to make racism even worse for people because they're going to refund police and they're going to make the police stronger. And secondly, they're going to do appointments like we have now a new mayor. Well, the primaries in New York, that mayorship was won, at least for the Democratic primary, by a Black mayor who is a former police officer. So what you're going to have now are Black people, Black rulers now put in places to make sure that the police are, trained properly and that they do that. But that's not what it's going to do. The police are going to be there. And the reason they have to refund the police and the reason the police must be expanded is not just because they like lying to us, but there has been gigantic criminality over this last year, and it was what's the amount? There was, I think it was $4.3 trillion that went upwards to the richest corporations. $4.3 trillion went from workers up to them, and they have more planned in place. So if you're going to keep that kind of, if you're going to keep that kind of wealth, and if you're going to keep it separated from workers, then you're going to need a giant police apparatus to make sure it's enforced, and that's what's happened. So this is the fruit of supporting the Democratic Party, and this is the fruit of thinking identity politics is the thing that's going to get you out of this trap. And this is the fruit of a movement that was not able to be independent, that was captured way back in June, whose only role, and I actually will say it had one success, it got Trump out and put Biden in. And good luck. Look what it got you. It got you more police. So the movement accomplished its goal, because its goal was never to fight racism. Its goal was never to actually deal with police brutality. Its goal, the stated goal of the Black Lives Matter leaders, was to elect Joe Biden, and under an identity politics framework. And that's exactly what the Biden administration has delivered, with all sorts of different people of different colors in one of the most authoritarian criminal regimes that we've had. Much more authoritarian than Trump, actually, but much more colorful as well. So good luck with that.
To me, this also emphasizes, the entire apparatus that creates narratives, right? People like or institutions like the New York Times are there not to sell you news, but to construct a narrative. Like you quoted earlier, they literally are lying about some of the statistics, and they are caught lying, and there's no consequences for them. They've done this when it comes to war. They did it with Afghanistan, Iraq. They also speaking in inclusive rhetoric, and while supporting and advancing these racist policies, right? Like, if we remember what got George Floyd killed, it was petty crime. What got Eric Garner killed, it was selling loose cigarettes in New York, and so on and so on. What has gotten, what got the Black Panthers and a lot of, more revolutionary, organizers in the U.S. killed? It was gun control. All these laws are they're constructed to police people. They're not constructed to protect anybody, and especially when we talk about this petty crime narrative that's being constructed. It is so fascinating how, all the arguments that you used to make, right? We need safer communities, right? We need to address the pathologies of capitalism. The houselessness. We live in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, one of the richest regions in the world, and we have some of the highest, indices of homelessness. That doesn't translate to petty crime or even criminality. It's not even close to the criminality that you mentioned, Lipson. The literal murder, rape, pillage that our ruling class does every day within the margins of the law. Because that's what the police is. The police is the monopoly of violence of the state. They have the right to be brutal. And when we look back at what's his name, the guy who killed George Floyd, Chauvin.
Yeah.
He didn't get punished, quote unquote. There was no justice because the system works. He was thrown under the bus because he caused riots and looting, right? That what the ruling class is really afraid, because no Disney-fied slogan is gonna make them afraid. No voting is gonna really make them afraid, because that's rigged. The only thing that makes them think is when people are really pissed. a lot of times I think back to the civil rights movement, and even some of the small gains that were made. They were they're made to be seen as, as Lyndon B. Johnson and JFK, were, these mavericks of progressive values. They were pressured because people were raising hell. People were, boycotting stuff. So again, this reformist vehicle is not a vehicle for social transformation. It's for more fascism, because that's what's going to happen. That's what I was afraid of. What's going to happen if we didn't advance this struggle, the BLM struggle, beyond that very narrow scope, of looking at race as the motivator of police violence, as one bad apple being the reason George Floyd died, and not the whole institution, the structure that is built to, punish people and punish them so they accept the pillage, the daily theft that we're all subjected to, the daily precarity that we are, subjected to, so we can be more desperate and sell our labor, and not think about organizing, not think about, looting. And that's why they need more police, because they are planning, to loot more. They are planning to create more precarity, and they know the potential unrest that could come up from that.
Kenny and I live here in San Francisco, and I have to look at the figures. I'm not quite sure what the demographics, but it's, I think, safe to assume that there's going to be a disproportionate amount of Black and brown people that are going to be the ones who are going to, quantify the amount of people who are being arrested or being charged with the violence that is existing. And some of it there might just be violence, right? I don't want to deny that there might just be some domestic violence. There might be some real heavy core stuff that might be going on in the city. But I also wonder how much of it is also quite categorized as violence because of because of the underground market, or because of conflicts that arise with people, or because of young people not having enough mentorship or not enough places to go, like with the reopening of schools and the closures. How much of that has contributed to a lot of what's been going on? So I really do want to see what would it fall under, but I also feel as if even if I did, it still doesn't include the violence and the looting that happens by white collar crime or the rich as well. And so I feel as if it's still targeted towards the people who are struggling, are working class people who are under capitalist pressures and who have a lot of maybe pent up energy or not enough outlets for our youth. I feel as if a lot of the violence that we have comes from trauma. It comes from people who have been in the cycles of poverty that continue to be have these festered trauma legacies in their families or in their neighborhoods. And this is all as a result of capitalism, right? Because you have a bunch of people who are just going to be pushed in one corner of the city, and they're going to be sticking around their group of people, and they're going to be not enough resources that are going to be allocated for those communities. So I do feel as if there would be many approaches that we could take, such as restorative justices or any sort of way to deal with it. But ultimately, even if we had all those approaches, it would be very difficult to implement any sort of holistic way to deal with the problems that we have, because we're still living in a system that is going to ultimately squash or squander or not going to allow for those approaches to come to its full fruition if we still are living under a system that sees incarceration as the answer, or the system that we live in, which is a capitalist system, as anything that is profit-driven as the answer to deal with issues. For example, if you're just encouraging youth or encouraging people that this competitive lifestyle that we're living in the society is how we should live, dog eats dog, of course we're going to have the violence that we have, because that's how capitalism thrives. We have to be able to live in a system that is competitive, and everyone else must be pushed down. And the people who are at the bottom, like the poor, are the ones who are then killing each other, because they're the ones who are left with all these devices of well, I don't have much to do or have much inspiration. I don't have much to live for. And they're going to do what they're going to do, and we just ignore it by putting those people in some neighborhood, in some place, either gentrifying their areas or even just incarcerating them. And police is what we try to in this society is to find the solution for. So I was listening to Upfront, which I encourage folks to listen to on this one episode, and it was on KPFA, and it was last Thursday, and it was a show on violence in Oakland. And they invited some of the people to come in from Oakland, and they discussed a lot of the things that are happening that I just talked about, but in depth about it, about the cycles of violence and in-depth trauma that has perpetuated within those communities, as well as some alternative approaches that we can take. What was missing from the conversation, though, was this emphasis on class and the emphasis on there was, I think, some mention of capitalism, but there was they were missing out on on tearing down this entire system completely to be able to keep those approaches sustainable, because it isn't sustainable to have some of the approaches that they were talking about, holistic approaches to deal with crime, to deal with violence, to deal with youth estrangement and lack of will to continue living in this very competitive world. And I just feel like if they could have discussed more of that, but I'll link it. And I just think that sometimes when people look at Black and brown communities, they oversimplify why there is the violence that is happening in those communities. And so they do a great analysis of it, and I feel like I won't do any good. I'm doing a disservice. But again, my point here is just to mention that it's beyond a holistic approach, right? I'll just stop there. Maybe I'm rambling a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree that the Black and brown communities are more violent. I actually agree with what we've seen is a massive increase in the violence of the capitalist class and their willingness to use the police force to make sure people got robbed. Like, first of all, capitalism is organized around daily theft. That's what profits are. Profits are stealing the value of workers' work from them. Okay, so that's always there. But when I found the number, when we talk about $3.4 trillion that went upwards and businesses were shut down. Businesses didn't shut down of their own volition. Now, yes, there was a fear narrative that got people to do it. But what was in place? If businesses chose not to shut down, who was going to make sure that they were shut down? The police. The police were there to make sure that they happened. The police are there to make sure that schools aren't going to be open in case workers got the idea that we want to open them. So the police and the military, potentially, if they needed to go there, they're not just being directed at one sort of crime, to ignore another. The police are involved in criminality. They're involved in the crime of stealing the wealth of workers and directing it towards the capitalists. Now, the capitalist class organizes that, but the police aren't just pointed at the wrong target. Their target is the working class. So you can't talk about reforming the police or even abolishing the police. That's why we said before, without talking about abolishing capitalism. And you can't talk about actually having kids, the kids you're talking about, Eduardo, living that kind of life of dignity or getting real services, it's not a question of sustainable. It won't be allowed under capitalism because there's no money in it, because there's no profits to be made out of it. If there was, they would do it, and they will be doing that under the human impact stuff that Allison's talking about. They're going to be they're going to find ways of financializing so-called helping kids, and we're going to see that it's going to become more and more a feature. But it's not. It's actually about disenfranchising them. So the way, Eduardo, we're going to get to that society, I'm not going to say this is the way, but one of the features of getting to that society where we get to determine our own lives for ourselves collectively is part of that is we're going to have to all be armed, or workers are going to have to arm themselves. And I want to point that out because that is going to be a feature of revolution. That's not the next step per se, but it is a feature of the revolution that must happen if wealth is going to be stripped from the people who've stolen it from us and brought it down here. So that part of that, so there are two ways in which the ruling class is preparing to make sure that revolution never happens. Number one, it's to make sure that the police are funded hugely, okay? And number two, it's to do gun regulation laws. And it's to basically say, we're going to strip guns away from people. Now, they've been able to trick people into say, oh, this is about taking, and this is the Democrats. This is, again, the Democrats playing the trick game and saying, like on one hand, you have the Republicans saying, look, the borders are crazy. This is another part of the violence that we need to prepare for. This is why we also need our police here, because the borders are crazy. By the way, Biden is continuing to put kids in cages and not doing anything. No one's doing anything about it. No one's saying anything about it because he's no longer Trump. But secondly, the Democrats are saying, no, it's not that. We're taking care of the insurrectionists. We're taking care of the white supremacists. We're going to take their guns away from these crazy white people, essentially. But here's the trick. The people who are going to be primarily the victims of the Democrats' anti-gun stuff are going to be people of color. They're the ones who are going to find themselves mostly being, and that historically is what's happened, is they're the ones who do the jail time for those laws. Yeah, there's going to be some white supremacists who are going to get, but the racism of this system is going to nail black and brown people twice. They're going to get one set of the capitalist class is going to openly attack them and saying immigrants are coming across the border and we got to fund the police to deal with that. The other section of the ruling class is going to attack black and brown people by talking about taking the guns away from white people. That's how it works. That's how our system works. It's lies through and through, and the whole thing has to be seen as a lie and has to be dealt with as a lie. And in this case, the lies are even in the statistics themselves. At least with COVID, you can talk potentially about some statistics that make it look more like a flu. Those are the death statistics now. But at least you can say there's some things here. Here, the statistics themselves don't even say that what they are calling criminality is even increasing. But I will tell you, crime is on the rise. Immense crime is on the rise. And that's because Biden is in office. And we've got a black general and a black vice president and a Latino board of education. The superintendent on education or the director of education. And there's a trans person who's in part of the cabinet. It's a woman who's part of the Treasury. This whole crew, this rainbow coalition of criminality is what is going to is really what needs to be fought. So that's the crime that's on the rise. And the Republicans are in on it too, but they're just playing a game of acting like they're arguing about it. And all they're really doing is figuring out how can they fool workers even more to fleece us even more this year and then the years afterwards, because they have to do it because they're taking on China and Russia and Europe.
And this isn't new, right? We've seen this. I would give us a break, or the people on the left, especially, a break. If this was a new trick, but this has happened before. Where they start the narrative, they use the apparatus of propaganda of the U.S. machine. They start the narrative about criminality, and often straight up racist. I think now they're learned their trick to be more, equitable, inclusive, and all this rhetoric. but regardless, it's still racist, and sexist and all these, isms. And so again, we've seen this trick. They're feeding us that same trick again, and there is no response. Quite the opposite. We're buying into this, and especially, it feels very hypocritical after BLM, right? In how we've been moving, shifted, and herded, a sheep, into the slaughterhouse. Especially, people from our communities. Upsets me that we are being narrowed and pigeonholed into just thinking about race. And we are going to pay the consequences of this. And also, look, I see what you were saying, Eduardo. There is a different type of interaction. There is a different type of violence that happens in poor communities. I grew up in some of them, in Guatemala, and basically in a very marginal community, the butthole of society. But I was always more afraid of the cops. Same here. I'm still more afraid of the cops than I'm of some dude randomly shooting up stuff. Because they can destroy my life. They can kill me alive. They can make me a slave of the state. By accusing me of something. Tell me that's not violence. Tell me that's not death. They can strip me away of being a member of this society at any point. By this petty crime bullshit. And guess what? Crime happens. Violence. There is violence, constant violence. In the wealthy houses too, like the violence that people are worried about. That shit happens all the time. They just covered it better. Rapists, they're in office. They're presidents. They're fucking CEOs. And they use this narrative of, the police need to focus on rapists. It wasn't one of the articles. If the police, if there is more funding for, healthcare and this and stuff, then the police can focus on the rapists and the violent criminals. The violent criminals get a license. They get to go rape and pillage abroad. And the intellectual, creators of this crime, they get rewarded handsomely for being violent. And so again, I just invite people to rethink, and add dimensions to the way we understand violence. And that's what concerns me, that we are buying this again and there is no response. And again, that sequence just is so scary. Abolish the police, defund the police, fund the police. It happened with ICE as well. Ocasio-Cortez made a career out of that shit. These tricks, they're not new. They're in front of us. And so, and then the audacity to, try to pass the George Floyd policing, what is it?
The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act.
To pretend they care because they want to make sure those bad apples, that's how they frame this narrative, that it's just some bad apple, that if we just give them better training, then it'll be fine. The institution of the police, again, is monopoly on violence. They're not there to, especially in the U.S., look at the statistics. The U.S. has the most violent police force of the world. It's not even, we shouldn't even frame it as that's their solution. That's their tool. It's not a solution. They're not trying to solve shit.
Correct.
They're just trying to use these to clamp down on the theft that we are subjected to, that we don't see.
I guess my contribution to, a lot of what both of you say I agree with. So I guess my contribution is just that I do think that it's nuanced. I do think that the violence that exists isn't grouped alongside the violence that exists from white-collar crime or from the crime that is committed by politicians or that is committed by the wealthy. So I'm in complete agreement there. Where I think I think where I'll take this is just, and here I might be stretching it. I'm not sure. Maybe you both can tell me if I'm stretching it. I also think that I saw a lot of young people when I was going to Oakland, and a lot of young people riding the trains on BART. And there were a bit of scuffles, a few that I saw. And I also remember hearing a bit of the local news about how there have been an increase in like robberies on BART on the way to Oakland. And I think about the young people that I see and sat next to in the last time I was there, which was in Saturday. And I think of the reopening of schools, and I think how, so this is where I'm taking it. I think of how it's not that I think schools were safe necessarily for our Black and brown children or just our kids in general. Under the system that we were in, it's that I think our institutions are places of revolution, right? Like there are places where our kids could come to be under guardianship or to be amongst other fellow adults and what we can create in schools. It's a place, it's a hub. And the closure of schools doesn't contribute to anything. It didn't create any safety. And our kids who, when you have adolescents, especially if you have kids in very poor areas, in small, enclosed areas that are not going to stay indoors because of the pandemic, they're not going to stay indoors. Especially my community isn't going to stay indoors. They're not necessarily the ones that are going to stay indoors. What's safer for them is going back to school. And it wasn't safe to be out of school. So I think what makes me upset is that the entire time that we were, of the movement that we were on the left, that we were struggling and organizing to have schools reopened or not, the whole narrative of why we were supposedly closing school was because we're trying to be safer at home. And so this is where I'm just saying, I just think the school should have been opened. I think that our kids need to be in a place where they can grow and thrive, and not again, it's not that I'm talking about the standardized top-down notch standard way of learning. I'm talking about places where they can co-congregate and have a safer place to be at. And that unfortunately was taken away from them. And of course, violence is going to peak. So that's where I feel frustrated, disappointed, upset. And I know a lot of my friends who are going to listen to this are just going to get more angry with me by saying that. So I'll leave it there.
Kenny, you want to go?
Yeah. So, I'm not a teacher like you two, nor
I'm not either.
But what you just mentioned is like, yes, like we've discussed here how schools are not even safe. The way schools used to be, they're not even safe, right? To create these free, well-rounded individuals. They're there to normalize you, to prepare you for theft, to prepare you to, and sort you through a system. So I do think, especially kids from poor communities, they have a lot of anger. I agree, they're frustrated. Why wouldn't you? Your parents, your parents, are going through hell to survive. You live through the precarity. You live in a shitty condition. Then they wave in front of you, right? That's why I kind of dislike reggaetoneros, rappers, because they are doing the bidding of this class. They are presenting to our kids, what we should aspire to, right? And so these kids are waved all these nice things in front of them, right? And so why wouldn't they steal some shit? Why would you go to your minimum wage job and just keep dreaming about this shit? Why wouldn't you be angry? And so if anything, we should tell them it's okay to be angry. Be angry at these fuckers that ruin your life, that ruin your parents' life, that are robbing you and accusing you of being violent, accusing you of being criminal, and criminalizing you and stripping you away of so many, so much dignity. So yes, they should be pissed. And then, we dismiss them as just being angry and irrational. This is the same narrative we use, about the countries that the U.S., has constantly, under target. This is the same narrative. It's not that different to me. We accuse people of being violent because they're responding to violence. That someone said this quote, that for the oppressor, peace is the absence of a response to their violence. So, I don't see any way, of solving this. No reform, no one, institution of doing away with this unless we do away with the precarity that this system creates. The violence that this system needs to use to create and maintain that precarity. So we're desperate enough to sell ourselves.
So I agree with you, Eduardo, that this also brings up schools for me. And like Kenny's getting at, and I think you acknowledge this, that the old schools of the old system were a trap, and the new schools of the remote system are a new trap and a worse trap, but still a trap. Like, this is the situation our students are finding, caught between old normal trap and the new normal trap. But the thing that was stolen from them from this year was their ability to be with each other, and the alienation and the civility that brings. It actually makes you more human to do that. So there was a lot of humanity stripped from us as workers as we were kept separated, to our students, to us who didn't get to be in our workplace together. We're not allowed to congregate in parks. We couldn't have, you couldn't have a certain number of families in places and all that kind of stuff, right? And having to wear masks, saying you don't get to see your face. And all these things were degrading to us and were destructive to us and so I do believe there's been a reduction in civility of workers and students that could be claimed to be called, I don't want to call it crime because it pales in comparison to the crimes that have been put against us and that are put against it. Like, that's my struggle at this moment. But I agree with you, Eduardo. I do think we have to return to the schools to remember what has been done to us. And there's going to be a price for that. And I think some of us who go back into the classroom are going to feel that price as our students struggle to figure out what to do with each other, having been kept apart for a year. One thing I want to say, Kenny, in response to saying that the Black Lives Matter wrongly put the focus on race or something that's maybe the way I heard it. I don't think their focus was race. Their focus was the Democratic Party, and then their focus being the Democratic Party, they had the stand-in for race be representation. That's where identity politics comes in, because I don't believe that the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, they can make words about racism, but clearly they don't care because they are not saying a thing about Biden refunding police. They're not saying anything. So clearly it was never about racism for them. It was about something else. And I would say it's about representation. And representation, well, have you folks heard about what's called the Black Boardroom Initiative? Do you know about this? So here's what it is. This is what Amazon and Starbucks and Facebook, I think, let me see I got to get these names right. Microsoft, and other companies all agreed that in the coming years that they're going to triple the number of either Black or people of color in their boardrooms. That is right there is the fruit of George Floyd's murder in the Black Lives Matter. More Black people or brown people or trans people or women in the capitalist boardrooms, because it's happening. They're going to triple the number of people in those boardrooms, and that is not about racism. That is what people call optics, and optics are a nicer way of saying lying to you. So what we're going to do is we're going to put up this lipstick of diversity while we create a wealth inequality and use that lipstick of diversity to cover the greater wealth inequality that's going to actually make lives worse. Yes, for white workers, but it's going to actually be worse for immigrant workers and Black workers more than white workers. That's how capitalism works. It needs to separate those workers so that they don't experience the same level of oppression, right? So the representation is going to be used as a cover for deeper racism. And there was a book that was put out by this dude. Let's see if I get it. E. Franklin Frazier wrote a book called The Black Bourgeoisie. And he wrote this: in the 1960s, there were 25 black millionaires. That number, since that time in 1960, has grown 60,000 times. There are now 1.5 million black millionaires and 7 black billionaires. My question is, has the lives for black people improved as a result of a 60,000 increase in the number of black millionaires? No, it's gotten worse. It has gotten worse. So more representation of elite black, brown, Muslim actually means it guarantees a greater divide in wealth, and it guarantees more racism in the system. That's all it delivers. And just as a way of highlighting it, the Credit Suisse Research Institute revealed, this is in 2020, that essentially it was asking how many people who have $30 million worth of wealth were created. And in the United States, 30 millionaires, basically people who have $30 million of wealth or more, that number of people increased to 21,313. And no other nation has even 10,000 30 millionaires. The United States increased this number to 23,000, and there's not another nation on the planet that has 10,000. And they get away with it because they got the Democratic Party, because they have identity politics, representation politics, and because we've created 60,000 more black millionaires. And that's part of this structure. And they're going to now use the refunding of the police and really the refunding of the FBI to ensure greater surveillance, greater pressure on workers, and make it so that when people again try to fight back, the capitalist class has more in place to make sure they can't.
You know, I just happened to listen to this podcast today. It's from Rev Left Radio. You know, there's someone there who's very good at, sifting through Marxist ideas, but I think in its application, the left has got a lot of things wrong. Like in applying Marxist analysis, you know, they were discussing how basically insinuated that LeBron James, having come from a, you know, lumpen proletariat background, you know, like the, you know, lower strata of the working class, he would, in a revolution, side with the revolutionary class. I'm sorry, but LeBron James ain't gonna give up, you know, his generational wealth that he's making right now. LeBron James is an agent of the bourgeoisie. He is bourgeoisie. You know, LeBron James is doing the beating on the state by playing these, you know, identity politics stuff, by representing the U.S., you know, in the U.S. flag, you know, this most violent nation, you know, who's done so much damage to black communities, but he got his. So I'm sorry, I'm putting my trust, if I was betting, I'm putting my trust on someone racist, you know, trucker from Alabama than LeBron James or Oprah Winfrey or Jay-Z or Beyonce or Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice, especially not our Vice President, Kamala Harris. You know, so let's get this right. Like, you know, wealth is wealth. And so we have more in common with those people that are struggling. And, you know, here we are bickering about race, you know, as if LeBron James is going to suffer the policing that someone from, you know, the VURBL here will do.
I just will say that I agree that this whole, you know, black women in power or black people having more wealth, or we need to have more people of color, you know, be in government. It just, I don't see how that is going to help out this leftist movement or the movement to be able to have a more, well, wherever we take this this revolution, whether it be a socialist or more of an anarchist, however. But I don't see how anti-capitalists can support that, because if we see, even Kamala Harris went to Guatemala, and was saying, don't come. I mean, from one person of color saying to other people of color, telling them, doing the bidding of the USA's work to tell with strong words poor people, to tell us Latinos, right? Something that I don't know if could have been said by a white politician, but because she is a black person and she is a person of color and she is, supposed to be this, this change, this woman in power. No, she said, and she did the bidding, and she said, don't come. I mean, it was very clear, right? So I think that our movement, our leftist circles, the side of the left is only deteriorating itself with this sort of framework. The framework of the identity politics is it's like slowly we're going to have nothing, because we think that that's the answer, the solution to it. No.
Yeah, and I would say not just that. Those kinds of things were said by the last administration, and they were made claims of, they were called racist dog whistles for doing it. And so Kamala Harris gets a free ride for doing it. It's a racist dog whistle from her then as well. So it doesn't change. Like, it's the same tune, just a different gender and a different skin tone. And I'm not just saying that's a trick that hurts the socialist cause or the cause of revolution. I'm actually saying that taking a section of black population and making them millionaires and billionaires comes at the expense of the masses of black people in this country. It means that they're going to be immiserated. Yeah, white workers are going to be immiserated. Anytime you create millionaires, that's going to happen. But the enrichment of just a few elite black people being used as a cover for to hide the racism that's in society creates the conditions under which capitalism can deliver even greater attacks on black and brown workers, because they have that cover, because they have those people to say, no, we're not racist. Look at our democracy. And it also gives them the cover for doing their mischief, across the globe, and talk about these other dictatorships. Whereas we have this wonderful democracy that believes in diversity. So it's all a complete sham to hide a very wicked and evil cabal of people there at the top. And the Republicans and Democrats are united in playing this little game with us. And unfortunately, we're falling for it. I will say, I was encouraged by this guy, Pastor Mike, who he talked about he was talking about the New York mayor elections, and he said, my biggest fear in this moment is a tough on crime national and local effort with a black face on it. And that's what we're getting. And he himself is black, and he was talking about the mayoral race in New York. And he's exactly right to be afraid of that, because that's what it means. It means that lives for black people and lives for black workers are going to get worse because we have a black mayor in New York.
Eric Adams, ex-police captain.
Yeah. He's not a mayor yet, but he will be when he's going to be a Republican, but he won the Democratic primaries.
What you're describing, to me, it's a play out of the Imperial Handbook.
Yeah.
Just grab a member of that community, give them power, give them access, and to be able to reach those levels of power and influence and wealth, you have to do some sinister stuff to be a member of that club. And we've talked about how the bourgeoisie, the top, the rulers, they function as a mob. And again, that's what I'm weary. Whenever I see someone of a certain community in power, prepare for an attack.
Yep. And I do want to also say, because our channel is called What's Left, question mark. And there was a left that was hooting and howling about these issues back in June, like Kenny was saying. And they have fallen silent now. So what that means is they never meant it. They were lying either to themselves or to us. Because if they meant it, then they would be saying something right now. But you will notice silence. So that left that was making such a noise over there, and they were right to make noise, well, it turns out they were lying. They didn't care because all they wanted to do was get Biden elected. And now they're going to keep their mouths shut because they're being told, if you say anything about the things you need, then we're going to lose the elections in 2022. And they're going for it because their biggest dedication is not to fighting racism. It's not for social equality. It's not for social justice. They are dedicated first and foremost to the Democratic Party. And I'm not talking just about officials at this point. I'm talking about anybody who was in those streets and who thinks it's all good now.
I think the other area, sorry, I just thought of something as we were discussing. The other area that I think that I'm also going to bring up is if we don't abolish the police, if we don't fight to get, if we keep going along with both Republicans and the Democrats' line of thinking, which is what we need, is more policing. If the left doesn't recognize that, the more funding there is to police, the more we're getting advanced in technology and AI and facial recognition and all of these militarized ways. I just fear that the revolution will be so difficult because of so much of the funding that is going into these militarized police, field. The police field is they're just advancing in the way that they are monitoring protests and the way that they are now advancing with technology. Amazon, I think, did a deal recently, if I'm not mistaken, no?
Yeah.
Or was it Microsoft? I forget, one of those two. But there was a deal that was made. I think it was first with Microsoft under the Trump administration because Trump did not like Amazon and Jeff Bezos. And then it was after that with this Biden administration, I think it's Samsung. But whatever the case, anyone can correct it on the comments below. But the thing is, it's the fact that these tech companies, Silicon Valley, is in cahoots with the government, and they are going to strengthen that arm, that capitalist force. No, so it's at all levels that we have to try to fight this. It's at the educational level, it's at the medical field, it's at the abolishing the police level. It is permeating everywhere. The Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies, the Internet of all these things. So I just think that going back to, I think, what we've also been discussing a lot of, which is what Alison has been talking about on our show here, which is we have to resist at all levels. It's not just the education field, right? It's at all levels, because we're just going to be controlled.
Yep.
I don't,
That's what, yeah, I mean, important point about it.
And I'm sorry, and that was what this was about too. It was about control. I don't want to say because we're going to get shut down again, but let's see how I can frame this. Last year showed us how much control there can be left because of emergency powers given to governments to be able to control populations. Yeah, that's how I frame it.
And again, we have to think of policing and fascism in a more multidimensional way, beyond the narrative that is sold to us, beyond the Nazis, in the Second World War, beyond, just a cop with a uniform. We have to see how we're being surveilled, tracked, how we are being denied of access to certain things, how behavior is conditioned. We've been censored here on this, platform, YouTube. And so, again, it goes beyond just the cops with the badge, right?
I will say, and tying this, I guess I'm seeing all these connections, but the other thing too is I really do hope that the left wakes up. I don't see it right now. I'm kind of desilusionado.
Yeah.
Disanimated.
Disillusioned.
Disillusioned that the left has been complicit in allowing the vaccine passports, in allowing the control of the being able to data mine us, or to be able to infringe on our privacy rights, or to be able to keep track of us, the contact tracing and all of this, because it's not about our safety, the medical field. It's about keeping a database of us and keeping us in check and having massive grids about where everyone is. And that's what that is going to be about. I understand that there is going to be under the name of safety, but it is really, oh, Jesus, it is really being able, it's like all this is in a bank that is going to be used then by government to be able to really track us, you know? Which is, again, I want to make the connection back to what we're discussing, which is the reason why we should abolish the police, because that's why our communities, our society is going to be controlled through that data, right? That's how people are being tracked and controlled.
I would just add that to abolish the police, you need to abolish the system. You know, and you know, the other thing is that for so much fear that was, injected into our world, really, through Trump, right? Like, he's this fascist, he's this fascist, he's this fascist. I believe that we live in a more fascist world, not just U.S., a more fascist world, and it's been delivered by the liberal progressives.
Yeah.
I mean, this one, Eduardo, there was a guy who recently watched our episode about the elections in Spain with the election of Vox. And I hadn't followed that, and you might have followed it, but I don't know. But the guy was basically saying that things have really changed taken a turn for the worse in Spain since the election of that party. And I couldn't speak to it, but he was like, "Yeah, they're bringing fascism here." And it was interesting because he basically was listening to our episode we had done a year ago. And Kenny, were you with us when we were talking about? I can't remember if you were
Spain. Yeah, there has been a shift in the tide.
Yeah, but it backs up what Kenny is saying, and I appreciate what you were saying, Eduardo, because I do think you were kind of getting at it's bigger than abolish, because you were saying it's about healthcare, it's about education, it's about the police, and that is the situation. This cannot be fought on a single front. It's going to be multiple areas that we're going to have to make.
Yeah, and I mean, I was yes, I agree. I mean, I hope that the passports was the link, right? Because I think that is going to be the way that people are going to try to criminalize us if we step out of line, and that information of us is really being just willingly given by people through this whole trying to find the right words here so we're not being edited out. Let's see. Let me just think of a good way to say this. You
hear West condition already.
Trying to keep this available for people. Under the guise of safety, right? We're giving out information willingly. Here, take my information. Take screenshots of me. Map me and grid me, and which will then be used, on this. So anyhow, that's where I think I'll leave it at for myself.
Yeah, I'm good. And Kenny, I think this was a good topic. I'm not sure if I'm going to keep this part when I'm asking, but are we up for taking that? Remember, Kenny, you had suggested maybe we were going to do like Afghanistan, and what do people think about carrying on into U.S. imperial? I think it should be about U.S. empire, or not just Afghanistan, but like the Biden administration, talking about elements of the plan of what we see going on. What do you think about that?
I think the Taliban has taken over a lot of districts in Afghanistan.
But I'm just saying,
there's a lot to discuss there.
Do you want
to take it there?
Do you want to keep it just in Afghanistan then? or can we go in, or
I think it's gonna open up. Like,
okay,
yeah.
Like we did today.
I definitely wanna cite one of the New York Times like phrases that the Taliban seem unreformed.
Oh, God.
All right. Well, that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast as channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes where we found this episode, or on our blog at what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast / channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you have heard here, please share your favorite episode, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and subscribe to any of our platforms on Spotify, iTunes Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Bitchute, LBRY, LBRY, Odysee, ODYSEE, or YouTube and Telegram. And if you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. I'm Eduardo Barca with Kenny Cepeda and Andy Lipson. We'll see you all next time.